The morning at the courthouse began as usual, with the usual bustle around. Judge Marissa Bennett, known for her sharp wit and unwavering sense of justice, walked up to the courthouse steps as she did every day, but today was different. At the entrance, she was stopped by a police officer, young, white, with an unmistakable aggression in his gaze. His eyes narrowed, filled with suspicion and contempt, and in that moment she realized this wasn't about the law, it was about the color of her skin. Without a moment's hesitation, the officer stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "Woman, you can't come here," he said with obvious disdain. He didn't know who was in front of him, or maybe he did, but it didn't matter to him. Marissa's heart began to beat faster, but not from fear. Years of working in court had prepared her for moments like this. What she did next turned the situation on its head and shook the entire courthouse. Before we continue this amazing story, let's get to know each other a little. Write in the comments where you are from. US look. Marissa Bennett stared at the officer, trying to read in his face the slightest glimmer of recognition of what he was doing, but his expression was impenetrable, a mixture of arrogance and cold confidence in his own power. This was not her first brush with racism, but here, on the threshold of the courthouse, the place where she would dispense justice, it felt especially bitter. The officer had not even bothered to ask who she was. It did not matter to him. In his eyes, she was simply a black woman, and that was enough to stop her at the door. "You can't come in here," he repeated, raising his voice slightly, as if she hadn't understood the first time. The people around him began to slow down, noticing the tension. It was that moment when everyone was looking at you, but no one was interfering. No one dared challenge the system. Marissa's emotions were swirling inside her, but she didn't let them spill out. Years of being a judge had taught her to control her every word and movement, but in that moment, she felt more than just outrage. It was something more, as if the very system that was supposed to protect everyone's rights had turned against her. She knew it wasn't just this officer. He was a product of centuries of racial prejudice and discrimination that were deeply ingrained in society. She took a step forward, deliberately slowly, never taking her eyes off his. The officer frowned, clearly not expecting such confidence from her. He straightened, instinctively placing his hand on his pistol holster, as if her presence were a threat. "I am Judge Marissa Bennett." Her voice was calm, but there was something in it that made everyone around her freeze. "And I believe I have every right to enter the courthouse." His eyes widened for a moment, but then something like a challenge flashed in them. He clearly wasn't going to back down, even though he now knew who he was dealing with. It was the manifestation of what many people hid under a veneer of politeness, a deep, irrational hatred born of ignorance and fear of the alien. "Prove it," he said, grinning and crossing his arms over his chest. His tone was as if he was mocking her, testing her strength. Judge Bennett had her accomplishments questioned simply because of the color of her skin. She remembered how, on her way to becoming a judge, she had to contend with the biases of her colleagues and the looks of distrust. Each time, she had to prove her competence doubly, as a woman and as a black person. A crowd had gathered around her, watching this silent battle. Some were clearly uncomfortable. They knew who she was, but they remained silent. Marissa knew what those looks meant, not fear, but indifference. Racism is rarely openly challenged. It's best ignored, or dismissed as someone else's problem, until it becomes yours. Marissa pulled out the identification from her bag that proved her authority as a judge. The officer glanced at it briefly, but instead of apologizing or even letting her pass, his face contorted into disdain again. "Judge," he said the word with obvious doubt. "How is that even possible?" His tone was mocking, as if a black woman in such a high position was absurd to him. That moment, that look, it all reminded Marissa of why she decided to become a judge. She'd seen too many of these situations. People like this officer believed the system was designed for them, that they would always be at the top, protected by a law that often worked in their favor. But she knew the truth. The law was supposed to be the same for everyone, and it was her job to fight for that. "I'm in court to fight people like you," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "And if you think you can stop me, you're wrong." The officer froze. Marissa hadn't expected him to back down, but his reaction was even more defiant than she'd anticipated. He stepped forward, pointedly standing directly in front of her, as if he were deliberately trying to block her path. "We have our own rules, and they are the same for everyone," he said with a grin. "Even for people like you." The words were an insult, a veiled attack. For people like her, they contained all the contempt she had felt her entire life, her entire career. But rather than give in to her emotions, Marissa knew that her weapon was the cold certainty of her own rightness. Marissa stood there, holding his gaze, not moving an inch. There was tension in the air, like a string that was about to snap at any second. The officer was sure he was right, but Marissa knew that it was moments like these that defined who you were, how you responded when injustice was thrown your way. "Like me?" she repeated, her voice low and calm, but with such force that it made some of the people around her shift nervously from foot to foot. "What do you mean, officer?" His grin widened, but there was something prickly in his eyes, like someone who felt like he was the winner in this little encounter. He thought he had the situation under control, as if her skin color was something he could use against her, questioning her dignity and right to be where she was. "You understand me perfectly, Judge." His voice was laced with venom. "Here in our city, we respect those who have earned their place, not those who got here by some quota or concessions." The crowd that surrounded them began to move less. People froze, their eyes darting from the officer to the judge, as if they couldn't believe their ears. Someone even gasped quietly, but no one dared to protest loudly. At that moment, the truth surfaced. Not only was this one man infected with racist prejudice, but also a society in which such moments had become habitual, ingrained in the consciousness. Marissa knew that people like this officer would use any excuse to undermine her accomplishments, but she also knew that she had something he couldn't take away: her knowledge, her fortitude, and her position, which was earned through hard work, not gratification. "Are you sure you're ready to discuss how I earned my position?" Marissa took a step forward, so that they were almost touching each other. Her voice was cold as steel, but every word carried a depth of experience. "Perhaps you want to talk about all the nights I spent studying the law, all the years I worked to protect those whose rights were trampled upon by the likes of you?" He winced slightly, but his smile didn't fade. He felt like he'd hurt her, that maybe she'd cracked, but Marissa knew better. Her real strength was that she knew who she was, knew the value of her work, and her path to the bench. This man, with his narrow views and pride, couldn't understand that. "You know what's interesting?" Marissa continued, her voice rising so that everyone around her could hear. "Your reaction isn't about me. It's about you. It's about your inability to accept that someone different from you can stand here, in front of you, as an equal. It's your fear. Fear that the world is changing. Fear that you'll have to stop hiding behind your privilege and face reality." His smile was now a grimace. He hadn't expected such confidence, hadn't expected her to take control of the situation. The crowd around him began to whisper. Someone took out a phone to record what was happening. "I'm not afraid of people like you," the officer barked, losing his composure. "Your words mean nothing here in real life. You can't change what is. The world has always been like this, and you can't change it with your words." Marissa took another step forward. She was so close now that he couldn't help but feel her confidence, her determination. Her words were now meant not only for him, but for everyone who heard this scene. "The world is changing, officer." Her voice was quiet, but it sounded like thunder in the silence. "And no matter what you think, the law works for everyone. And every time you try to break the likes of me, you only strengthen our resolve. Now, step aside." She showed her ID again. "Otherwise, you'll have to explain your behavior in court." He froze in silence. They stared at each other for a few seconds, and the air was tense. He clearly wanted to say something, wanted to challenge her, but knowing that his every move was being watched and recorded, he couldn't afford to make a mistake. His hands slowly slipped from his belt, and he took a step to the side, still seething with anger. Marissa stepped past him, her back straight, her head held high. Her heart was still pounding, but she knew it was a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who saw the scene and realized that the fight for equality was ongoing every day. When she walked into the courthouse, the atmosphere changed. Now everyone knew who she was. Everyone realized that this was not just a judge, but a person who fought for justice every day, despite hatred and prejudice. As Marissa entered the courthouse, the feeling of victory was slightly eclipsed by an inner tension. She knew that every move she made today would be under intense scrutiny. This incident at the entrance was no accident, it was part of a deeper problem that permeated society. But she couldn't afford to relax. The trial was set to begin in a few minutes, and she had grown accustomed to wearing not only a judge's robe, but also a suit of armor that protected her from the daily racism that surrounded her. As she entered the courtroom, she made eye contact with the lawyers, the defendants, the witnesses, and the jurors. The room was silent, the whispers fading as she passed. Everyone knew what had happened at the entrance, and every time it happened, it left an invisible mark on everyone. It didn't matter who you were, a judge, a lawyer, or just a passerby. When the system you defend rejects you, it hurts. She took her place on the bench, the case before her, but even in these moments of professional work, her thoughts returned to the officer at the door. He was not the first to look at her with such disdain, nor would he be the last. This incident was another reminder that even in the highest positions, she still faced the same challenges as the average black person on the street. The only difference was that she was in the public eye, her response an example for others to follow. The trial began, but a new wave of anxiety was growing. During a break, a bailiff approached her, an older man with kind but tired eyes who had worked in this building for decades. He leaned toward her, quietly asking, "Judge Bennett, is everything all right? I heard what happened at the entrance. Do you want me to talk to the authorities? We can conduct an internal investigation." She looked at him carefully. Was this another gesture of polite sympathy, often offered but rarely followed through? Perhaps, but she felt she needed to do more. "Thank you, John." She nodded, her gaze hard. "But I don't think we can just let this go. People need to understand that things like this don't happen without consequences. We need to make it clear that these actions aren't just one person's mistake. They're part of a problem that we need to acknowledge and address." John nodded, his eyes clouded with sad thoughts. He had seen a lot in his career, and Marissa knew he probably hadn't expected things to change quickly, but she wasn't about to give up. When the break ended, the trial continued, but after the session concluded, Marissa went straight to the Chief Justice's office, where the Chief Justice, an experienced and respected man who had known Marissa and her fight for justice for a long time, was waiting for her. "Marissa, I heard what happened," he began as she entered his office. "This is unacceptable. This officer needs to be punished, but you know this is just the tip of the iceberg." She nodded, feeling tired of such talk. She was surrounded by many colleagues who supported her in private conversations, expressed sympathy, but few were ready for real action. "I understand that punishing an officer is a step," Marissa said, sitting down across from him, "but if we don't elevate this issue, it's going to stay the same. What worries me more is that this culture is encouraged by silence. Anytime someone sees racism and stays silent, it's not just passivity, it's complicity." The chief judge sighed and folded his hands on the table. "You're right," he said, studying her face. "But how do you propose to do that? We could file a complaint against a specific person, but the system, it's too big, and change takes time." Marissa knew he cared, but she also knew he was part of the same system that was slow to change. She paused for a moment, considering her words. "I want to use this to make a public statement," she finally said. "I can't just walk away and pretend it didn't happen. If we start talking about it openly, in the media, in the courts, it could create a ripple effect. We can offer racial bias training to employees. People need to understand that racism is not an individual problem. It's a problem with the system we live in." The Chief Justice looked thoughtful. Marissa could see him weighing her words. To accept such a proposal would be to admit that there was a problem, and that could cause a backlash that not everyone was prepared for. "This is a bold move, Marissa," he said slowly. "I support you, but you must be prepared to resist. You know that such changes do not please those who prefer to maintain the status quo." "I'm ready," she answered confidently. "It's time to change the rules of the game. I can't stay silent any longer, and I won't let others do it either." As Marissa left the Chief Justice's office, she knew she had taken an important step. This fight for justice was much bigger than her personal conflict with one racist. It was part of a global fight for equality and human dignity. And while there were challenges ahead, Marissa knew she could not back down. She was a judge not only by profession, but also by spirit. As Marissa left the Chief Justice's office, her heart was beating faster than usual. She knew she had taken a step towards something greater, but the weight of the fight ahead hung over her like a thick fog. The Chief Justice's words echoed in her mind, "Be prepared for resistance." It wasn't just friendly encouragement, it was a warning. He knew how the system worked, and he knew that what lay ahead was not just cold rejection, but open hostility. But Marissa had already made up her mind. She couldn't stay silent any longer. As soon as she returned to her office, her assistant, Emma, was already waiting for her at the door, nervously shuffling through papers. "Judge Bennett, did you hear that?" Emma whispered. Even though they were alone, her face was tense. The video of what happened at the entrance was leaked onto social media. "It's starting to get around." Marissa paused, feeling a wave of tension run through her body. She knew this moment would get attention, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. Now the story had spilled out of the courtroom. People across the country could see a black woman, a judge, being humiliated by a police officer acting on his racist beliefs. "And what do they say?" she asked, remaining calm, although something inside her was clenching. Emma swallowed nervously and placed the tablet with the open video on the table in front of Marissa. "The reviews are mixed," she said slowly. "A lot of people are supportive, talking about how important it is to talk about this. But then there are those who defend the officer. They say it was a misunderstanding, that he was just doing his job. And then there are, well, some downright racist comments." Marissa knew it would happen. There were always those online who wouldn't admit the obvious, who saw her not as a person but as a symbol of a struggle they didn't understand or didn't want to understand. But seeing the comments with her own eyes was different. She quickly scrolled down the few lines of text beneath the video. "She's playing the victim. It's always like this. Black people try to make themselves heroes. The police are upholding the law, not politics." Some of the comments were so openly hateful that they were physically unpleasant. Marissa put the tablet aside and took a deep breath. She knew this was just the beginning. "Emma," she said, looking at her assistant, "we need to get ready. I'm going to make an official statement about this. We can't just let this die down and go on as usual. This is too important." "But are you sure?" Emma was clearly worried. "You know how this could turn out. People could start digging into your past, trying to find something to discredit you. It's a dangerous game, Judge Bennett." "I understand," Marissa replied firmly, "but we have no other choice. Silence will not help. If we remain silent, who will protect those who do not have our voice? This case can become an example for others. If I do not take this opportunity to step forward, who will?" That evening, when Marissa returned home, she felt like the weight of the world on her shoulders had grown even heavier. She sat on the couch, turning on the news to take in the developments. Reports of the incident had already begun to appear on major TV channels. Some journalists were supportive, talking about how systemic racism still permeates the police and the courts. But there were others who painted it differently, as a simple misunderstanding, as overreach on both sides. Every time Marissa heard those words, her heart sank. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a story about racism hiding behind the mask of law and order. Suddenly the phone rang. It was an unknown number. For a second she considered whether to answer, but her intuition told her it might be important. "Hello?" she said, slightly wary. "Judge Bennett?" The voice on the other end was familiar, but she didn't recognize it right away. "This is Inspector Harris. I'm the one in charge of the police department this officer belongs to." Marissa tensed. It could have been an apology, or an attempt to smooth things over. She knew that such calls were often meant to solve the problem quietly. "Yes, I'm listening to you," she answered coldly. "I'd like to suggest that we meet to discuss what happened," he said diplomatically, but Marissa sensed a note of concern. "We understand that this incident has caused quite a stir, and I think we could find a way to resolve this without too much publicity. Here it is," an attempt to hush up the matter. "Inspector Harris." Marissa paused before answering. "With respect, I don't think this can be handled without publicity. This isn't just a mistake, it's a systemic problem, and I'm not going to let it remain behind closed doors. Judge, you must understand that such cases can cause unnecessary tension, he said a little more insistently. The police are already under enormous pressure. There is no need to blow this incident out of proportion. Marissa closed her eyes, trying to contain the anger that was rising inside her. How often had she heard these phrases? Don't make a big deal out of it. Don't make it complicated. Don't make an issue out of it. Each time they happened, she knew they were an attempt to hide the truth, to put out the fire of justice before it could flare. This is no longer just an incident. Her voice was firm but calm. This is part of a bigger picture, and if you really want to solve the problem, Inspector Harris, you have to admit it. Trying to hush it up won't solve anything. People are tired of being silent. He paused on the other end, clearly weighing her words. I understand, he finally said, but be prepared for this to provoke a strong reaction, and not just from the police. Marissa answered briefly and hung up. She couldn't sleep for a long time that night. Thoughts about what was coming next haunted her. She knew she had brought the storm upon herself, and that this was only the beginning, but she had no other choice. Every action, every remark, every look of contempt was a reminder of what she was fighting for. This fight for justice was her destiny, and she couldn't let fear silence her. In the morning, she was awakened by a loud knock on the door. She approached the door, feeling strangely uneasy. When she opened it, she saw an envelope on the threshold. Inside was a letter without a signature. The words on the paper were short, but they made her blood run cold. Be careful, Judge Bennett. We're watching. Some people know when to stop. I'm sure you do too. It wasn't just a hint. It was a threat. Marissa held the envelope in her hands, her heart sinking as she read the short, menacing words. Careful, Judge Bennett. We're watching. Some people know when to stop. The lines on the paper seemed thick, as if each letter had been written with the intention of striking her, but not physically. This was psychological pressure, an attempt to intimidate her into silence. She sat down slowly on the couch, the envelope still in her hand. The room was silent, except for the sound of her breathing and the faint noise of the street. Fear crept into her, but it did not paralyze her. This was nothing new. Such threats could come in many forms, sometimes as rude as this anonymous envelope, sometimes as friendly advice, but this felt different, more acute. For the first time, Marissa understood how far those who felt threatened by her voice and her position would go. They wanted to silence her, but the question was, how far were they willing to go? The ringing of the phone abruptly pulled her out of her thoughts. It was Emma. Judge Bennett, her voice was worried. I just saw the news. There was a report about you. The video went viral. It's everywhere now. Marissa held her breath. What are they saying? She asked, although she could already guess the answer. There is widespread discussion about racism in the police, the justice system, and you, but the strangest thing is, Emma hesitated before continuing. There are now comments from those who are clearly not on your side. They claim that you provoked the officer yourself, that you were trying to start a conflict. There are even videos with clips of you being aggressive. Marissa closed her eyes and sighed. It was expected. The media could be merciless. Her attempts to convey the truth could be turned against her, but not because she was wrong, but because for some people it is always more convenient to believe in provocation than to admit the existence of racism. I knew it wouldn't be easy, Emma, she said quietly, but we can't stop now. If they're trying to turn this around on me, it means they're afraid of the truth coming out. You're right, Judge, Emma sighed, but you're going to face more pressure. What are you going to do? I have to fight, Emma, Marissa said firmly. This isn't just about me. This is about everyone who faces this every day and doesn't have a voice. I'm a judge, and I have to fight for justice. But most of all, I'm a person who knows what it's like to live in a world that doesn't want you, and I won't let them silence me. Emma didn't answer, but Marissa could hear her struggling to hold back tears. The conversation reminded her that many of the people who supported her were also afraid. They had hope for change in their hearts, but they saw how easily the world broke those who went against the system. As Marissa hung up the phone, she knew she had to think about her next move. On the one hand, This was a public battle, and she had to be prepared for all her decisions to be under scrutiny. On the other hand, the anonymous letter, that was a new level of threat. What if this wasn't just an attempt to intimidate? She decided not to ignore it and contacted John, the bailiff who had already offered to help. Half an hour later, he was at her house. When Marissa showed him the letter, his face darkened. "This is serious, Marissa," he said quietly, studying each letter on the paper. "This isn't just a warning, it's a threat. Someone really wants you to stop." "I can't, John," she said firmly. "I know it's dangerous, but if I stop, I'll admit they're right. They want to silence me, but if I give in, what will that say to those who look at me and see hope?" John sighed, his face showing the depth of his concern. He was an experienced man, and had seen situations like this before, but even he knew this case was special. Marissa was a black woman, a judge, standing up to a system that had held back people like her for centuries. "I understand," he said finally, "but you have to be careful. I'll talk to the police. I have some connections. I'll try to find out where this letter came from, but you have to be on your guard. And also, you said you were going to make a public statement?" Marissa nodded. She had already made this decision, and despite the threats, she was firm in her intention. "Yes, I can no longer remain silent. We must begin an open dialogue about racism and the justice system, and if this becomes an example for other judges or public figures, so much the better." John frowned but said nothing. He knew there was no stopping her now. There was too much at stake. The next day, Marissa walked into the courthouse with a determined look in her eyes. A crowd of journalists and activists had gathered at the entrance, some holding signs supporting her fight, others with slogans screaming that she should leave politics aside. Cameras were clicking every second, and Marissa knew her every move would be closely watched. She walked up to the podium in front of the building, sighed and began to speak. "My name is Marissa Bennett, and I am the judge of this city. But most of all, I am a human being who faces the same injustices as millions of others. The recent incident with the police officer outside this courthouse was just the last straw. It was not a simple misunderstanding, as many would have it. It was an act of bias that we, as a society, have tolerated for far too long." There were cries of support from the crowd, but also outrage. Someone shouted, "This is politics. Resign as judge." Marissa paused and looked out into the crowd. "I am not here to stir up conflict, as some claim. I am here to show the truth. The truth is that racism is not a rare exception in our justice system. It is built into it, and if we do not start talking about it openly, we will only perpetuate this injustice." The crowd froze. Some wrote down her every word. Others stood talking, but she felt she had their attention. This was her moment. "I've received threats," she said, her emotions breaking. "They're trying to silence me, but I won't remain silent, because silence is complicity. Every time we turn away from injustice, we become part of it." The reporters were excitedly taking notes, and Marissa knew that this statement would be all over the news, but she wasn't going to stop. "I am addressing those who are listening to me now and who may be facing similar problems. You are not alone, and I am not going to stop until the system starts changing." The crowd roared again, some applauding, others whistling, but Marissa felt that despite all the chaos and pressure, this was the moment of truth. She walked down from the podium, her heart pounding. She still had a long way to go, but she knew one thing: she was not alone, and that gave her the strength to keep fighting, despite all the resistance. Marissa felt the tension building in her chest as she walked down from the podium, aware of dozens of eyes on her. The crowd buzzed like a swarm of angry bees. Cameras clicked. People shouted her name. She knew that her every move would now be watched. Some in the crowd looked at her with hope, as a symbol of the fight against injustice. Others with disdain and hatred, as an enemy of the system they had come to trust. Amidst all the chaos, she saw John standing in the shadows, watching the scene with a grim expression. He motioned for her to come over. Marissa approached, trying not to lose her composure, even though the tension inside her was growing. "You did well," he said quietly as she came closer, "but be careful. You're not just a judge now. You're a symbol, and symbols like that are rarely safe." "I know," Marissa replied, looking back at the journalists and police officers standing in the distance, as if ready to intervene at any moment. But there's no turning back now. I can't afford to back down. John nodded, but his face remained tense. He wanted to say something, but then a voice full of fury sounded nearby. "You're betraying your country," a man from the crowd shouted, pushing his way closer to her. "You're trying to destroy everything we've built. Your accusations are lies. You're just a devil playing the victim." Marissa froze, looking at the man's face, white, about 40 years old, his face twisted with anger. She saw in his eyes not only hatred, but also fear. Fear of change, fear that his familiar world could collapse because someone dared to challenge the system. "I do not speak for myself," Marissa said firmly, holding back her emotions. "I speak for those who have suffered injustice for too long." "What injustice?" The man raised his hand as if ready to hit her, but John instantly stood between them, grabbing his hand. "Easy," John snapped, pinning the man to the ground in one swift motion. "You're crossing the line." The police immediately rushed to intervene, and Marissa only had time to notice how several cameras recorded the scene. Tension hung in the air. She knew that everything that was happening now would be used against her. Another reason for criticism, another proof of incitement to conflict, but she was not going to back down. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, looking straight into the eyes of the man John was holding. "Your fear of the truth is not my problem." As the police led the man away, she turned to John. "See," he said quietly, "people like that won't stop. They'll attack you at every turn." "I know, John," she replied, looking down, "but if I retreat now, it will give them victory, and I cannot allow that." Marissa returned home. She felt exhausted. She closed the door behind her, finally alone. A feeling of oppressive fatigue enveloped her, but at the same time, an unquenchable flame of determination burned within her. The world was waiting for her to act, and she knew that her next step would be decisive. She sat down on the couch, picked up her tablet, and started scrolling through the news. Her performance was already being hotly debated. Some news stories portrayed her as a heroine, ready to fight the system for justice. Others portrayed her as a problematic judge who uses her position to create unnecessary conflicts. And everywhere there were comments, thousands of voices arguing about her without knowing her personally. Traitor to the country, heroine fighting for the truth, destroyer of law and order. These comments were like blows, each one trying to knock her off balance. She knew that not only her reputation was at stake, but the very essence of her fight. Every word, every reaction could be the very last straw that would determine the outcome of all this. But suddenly her gaze stopped on a message from an unknown number. "We warned you. Don't tempt fate." Marissa felt a chill run down her spine. It was another warning. Only this time it wasn't hidden behind polite words or innuendo. It was an outright threat. The next day, when she arrived for work, the atmosphere in the courthouse was tense as never before. Protesters had gathered around the court again, some supporting Marissa, and some demanding her dismissal. Journalists were there, recording every move. She walked into her office to find Emma there, looking pale. "Judge Bennett," Emma's voice trembled, "you have another letter." And this time it was delivered in person. Marissa tensed. "What is it?" she asked, already anticipating the worst. Emma handed her an envelope. It was the same type as the previous letter, but this time there was something else inside. When Marissa opened it, she saw a picture of herself leaving her house. In the picture, she was walking to her car, and it had been taken the day before. Someone had been following her. "This is too much." Emma was on the verge of panic. "You need to call the police. This is dangerous." Marissa gritted her teeth, her body tensing as she realized the game had reached a new level. The threat was real, and someone was clearly not going to stop. "I know," she said, clutching the photograph in her hands, "but I won't stop. I'll do everything I can to stop them from winning." Emma looked at her with horror and admiration at the same time. She knew that her boss was a strong woman, but even she could not predict that Marissa would be ready to go all the way, despite threats to her life. "Okay," Emma said quietly, "but please be careful." Marissa just nodded, although she knew perfectly well that caution might not be enough. She was on the brink of a major fight. and it was impossible to stop. Now her fight wasn't just personal, it was bigger than her life or her career. It was a fight against a system that had held millions of voices captive for centuries, and despite it all, Marissa knew one thing: she wouldn't let fear silence her. She pulled out her phone and dialed John's number. "John," she said when he picked up the phone, "we need to meet. I think the game is just beginning." There was a heavy silence in the office as Marissa hung up. Every second seemed like an eternity, and a sense of impending danger was growing inside her. This whole situation was spiraling out of control. Each day brought more threats, and now she realized that the fight for justice wasn't just being fought in court. This was a war for her life, for her right to have a voice. A few minutes later, John stood in her office. He looked stern, his face expressing deep concern. "I just got a copy of your file," he began, trying to keep his composure. "The threat is real. This isn't just someone trying to scare you. This is someone who's willing to go the extra mile. Marissa, we need to protect you." "John, I can't let fear stop me," she replied, not looking away. "If I turn now, it will be a victory for those who are trying to shut me up. I must continue." "I understand." John's voice softened, but his gaze remained intense. "But there's a fine line between courage and recklessness. I see the pressure you're under, and I simply can't allow you to become another victim of this system. These people are dangerous, Marissa." She turned away to hide her true emotions. She wanted to be strong, to show that she could handle this, but the reality was different. The threats were becoming more direct, and she was afraid. "They're watching me, John," she said finally, her voice barely trembling. "I got a photograph this morning. I was photographed outside my house. Someone is watching my every move." He slowly approached her, trying to understand the depth of her fear. "This isn't just stalking, Marissa. This is a deliberate hunt. They want to make you either back down or, worse." She balled her hands into fists, her nails digging into her skin. She could feel the adrenaline pumping through her blood. She had always been the one to fight until the end, but this situation was a game changer. They weren't just threatening her career, they were threatening her life. But despite this, her resolve didn't waver. "I will continue anyway. Let them know that I am not afraid. Let them see that no threats will silence me." Her voice trembled, but there was steel in it. John looked at her and exhaled. He knew she couldn't be persuaded to give in, but he also knew that he had to take drastic measures. "Okay," he said finally, "but we have one way out. I can arrange for you to be protected. We'll start an investigation to find out who's behind this. They shouldn't feel like they're going unpunished." Marissa nodded, agreeing with the proposal, although a storm raged inside her. She didn't want to live under guard, didn't want to feel trapped in her own life, but she had no choice. This had become her new reality. That evening, Marissa returned home accompanied by 2 bodyguards hired by John. Despite her outward calm, she felt their presence with every cell of her body. They followed her everywhere, from the car to the door, from the kitchen to the bedroom. This control drove her crazy, but she understood that it was necessary. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. One of the guards approached the door and, after carefully checking the peephole, opened it. There stood a man she had not seen for many years. It was Raymond, her older brother. "Ray," she said in surprise, approaching the door. "What are you doing here?" Raymond, tall and powerfully built, entered the house, glancing at the guards. He looked worried. "I found out about what was happening to you," he said, bitterness in his voice. "I couldn't just sit back. Marissa, I know how dangerous this is getting." She closed the door behind him and gestured to the guards to give them a minute alone. "Ray, I have everything under control," she tried to reassure him, although she knew that wasn't entirely true. "You're not in control. Damn it," he exploded, turning on her sharply. "You're being stalked, threatened, and you act like it's just another day at work. This isn't a game, Marissa." Her heart began to beat faster. She knew that her brother had always been straightforward and sometimes short-tempered. He loved her and was always ready to protect her, but now it was like a knife on an exposed nerve. "I can't just walk away, Ray," she said quietly, trying to maintain her composure. "I can't let these people win. You know what's at stake, right?" Raymond fell silent, clenching his fists. He looked at her with concern and pain. "I understand," he finally said, "but I'm not ready to lose you. You're not immortal, Marissa. You can't fight everyone. Sometimes you have to retreat to survive." Her eyes filled with tears, but she held back, gritting her teeth. "If I retreat, what will happen to those who don't even have a chance to fight? What will happen to those who remain silent out of fear? You think I can just walk away, but I can't. I took on this burden because someone had to, and if I give in now, it will be a defeat not only for me, but for everyone who fights for the truth." Raymond sighed heavily and hung his head. He knew there was no point in arguing with her. Her resolve was unbreakable, but he feared for her, more than he had feared for anyone in his life. "You've always been stubborn," he finally murmured, "but be careful, Marissa. This world isn't as simple as you think. Sometimes being right doesn't save you. Sometimes it ruins you." She walked up to him and gently took his hand. "I know, Ray, I know, but I'm willing to take the risk, because if I don't, who will?" That night, Marissa couldn't sleep for a long time. Thoughts swirled in her head like a whirlpool. Every sound in the house seemed suspicious. Her life had become a constant state of alert. Bodyguards were on duty outside, and everything in the house was too quiet. She opened her eyes in bed, feeling fear and tension suffocating her. Suddenly, a strange knock was heard in the house. The silence was broken, and her heart began to beat in a frantic rhythm. She stood up, looking around, and heard footsteps on the first floor. In a panic, she grabbed the phone, intending to call the guards, but then the bedroom door slowly began to open. Marissa's heart was pounding as the bedroom door opened. She knew her life was on the line and that no shadow could be her enemy. A figure stood before her. It was John, her lawyer and close friend. He looked worried, his face was pale, and she felt the tension build. "Marissa," he said quietly, but there was alarm and urgency in his voice. "We need to talk. It's urgent." "What happened?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "Why are you here at this time?" He came closer, looking around carefully, as if he was afraid that someone might be watching them. "I just got word from my sources. We found out who's behind the threats, and it's not just some local fanatics," he said, leaning closer, his voice quieter but even more intense. "It's a whole group, connected to corrupt police officers and local politicians." John's words hung in the air like lightning in a clear sky. Marissa felt a chill run down her spine. She knew there were people in town who were unhappy, but she had no idea it was this serious. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice full of determination. "Who are these people?" John took a deep breath. "A group known as the Sons of Liberty. They are considered a paramilitary organization opposed to changing the status quo. They will not stop until they are sure you will back down. And this is not just a threat. They are planning to do something terrible." Marissa stepped back, feeling a growing sense of fear and rage wash over her. "We have to stop them," she said, feeling a surge of strength. "We can't let them hurt me or anyone else. We have to do something before it's too late." John nodded, his face showing concern, but he too felt determination burning within him. "We can go to the federal authorities, but they may be corrupt. It could be dangerous," he added. "There is another option." "What?" she asked, not understanding what could be more risky than what they had already experienced. "We can create a network of informants, people who know what's going on in their communities. We can gather evidence and use that to expose them, but that would be dangerous." She realized that this was a really risky move, but at the same time, it could be the only way to stop this group. She couldn't let fear rule her life. "I'm ready," Marissa said, her voice determined. "We must act now." Over the next few days, he and John began gathering information, looking for people who could help them in their fight. They held meetings with local activists who agreed to provide information about the Sons of Liberty. Soon, their group began to grow, including people willing to fight against injustice. Each meeting revealed the depth of the problem. They learned that the Sons of Liberty were not just a group of disgruntled people. They were a well-organized network, permeating local politics, business, and even law enforcement. These men used intimidation and threats to maintain control, and they had connections at the highest levels. At one of the meetings, When the group was gathering in a small cafe, they were approached by a woman named Laura. She was familiar with local politics and told them shocking information. "I worked for one of the mayors," she began, looking around as if she was afraid someone might overhear. "He's involved with the Sons of Liberty. He provides them with funding, and they protect his interests. They're used to eliminate anyone who might threaten his power." Marissa felt a spark of anger flare in her chest. "We have to expose him," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "If we can connect him to this group, it might stop them." Laura nodded. "But it will be difficult. He has powerful connections, and he will stop at nothing to protect himself. You will need support." Marissa considered her words. She knew it would be risky, but maybe this was the turning point they had been waiting for. They needed to come up with a plan to catch the mayor red-handed. "We'll keep an eye on him," she said. "We have a chance to get this right." A few days later, she and John began following the mayor. That evening, they discovered him holding a closed meeting with members of the Sons of Liberty. Marissa and John quickly organized a team to document the event. They knew this could be a key moment. Hiding behind trees and bushes, they waited for the mayor to emerge from his office. Suddenly, she saw a group of masked men emerge from the darkness. They were talking to the mayor, their voices full of threats and intimidation. "We cannot allow her to continue her fight," one of them said as they stood nearby. "If we do not stop her now, she will become a threat to everything we have built." Marissa froze when she heard it. They were talking about her. This wasn't just about fighting injustice, it was a matter of life and death. She whispered to John and they began recording, trying not to give themselves away, but suddenly one of the men noticed them. "Hey!" he shouted, pointing at them. "There's someone there." The situation quickly got out of hand. Marissa and John turned and ran. They could hear the men following them, shouting threats. "Run!" John shouted as they burst into the street. "We need to get to the car." Marissa's heart pounded in her ears as they raced down the street, but she could hear footsteps behind her. Her legs were wobbly and she felt her strength draining away. Suddenly, she tripped and fell to the pavement. At that moment, she felt John grab her arm and pull her along. "Get up, Marissa," he shouted, his voice full of panic. They jumped up and ran to the car, but suddenly there was a sharp sound of a gunshot. Marissa froze in horror when she felt something hit her in the shoulder. Pain shot through her and she fell to the ground. "Marissa!" John shouted, rushing towards her. He leaned over and she saw his face full of fear and horror. "We have to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here." I can't," she whispered, feeling the strength leave her. "John, it hurts." Suddenly they heard footsteps. Several more men from the Sons of Liberty group ran up to them. They were aggressive and full of hatred. "We said she had to be dealt with," one of them said, looking at John with disdain. "Now she'll pay for her actions." "Get out," John shouted, standing up for Marissa. "Don't touch her." Marissa, despite the pain, reached out to grab John's shoulder. "John, don't," she said, realizing that their situation was hopeless. "Save yourself." But he had no intention of leaving. His determination only grew stronger. "No, I won't leave you," he shouted, trying to get her to her feet. At that moment, the sound of police sirens was heard. The men became frightened and began to crawl away, leaving them alone. They knew that any movement towards the police could end badly. "Are you okay?" John asked, but Marissa felt her consciousness begin to darken. "I don't know," she whispered, and her world began to blur. When Marissa came to, she found herself in a hospital. The soft light from the lights in the room hurt her eyes, and she raised her hand to her head. "You're okay," the nurse said, noticing that she was awake. "You're seriously injured, but you'll be okay. The doctors did everything they could." Marissa glanced around the room and saw John sitting next to her, his eyes full of worry, and he let out a sigh of relief when he noticed that she had come to her senses. "Marissa," he cried, leaning toward her, "you gave us a fright. I thought I'd lost you." "What happened?" she asked, trying to remember the details. "You were shot," he said, his voice shaking, "but we found you, and the medics got there in time. We need to talk about what happened. We have to catch these people," she said, her voice determined despite the pain. "This can't go unpunished." John nodded, his expression turning serious. "We are already working on it. I have contacted the federal authorities. They are ready to help, but we need time. We need to do everything right." Marissa felt determination welling up inside her. They were on the verge of something big, and she wasn't going to give up. "I can't leave it like this, John," she said. "We have to be strong. If we don't stop them, they'll keep doing this to others." At that moment, a policeman entered the room. He looked stern and confident. "I'm Chief Inspector Brown," he said, looking at Marissa. "We're investigating an incident. You can help us when you're ready." She nodded, her thoughts focused. She knew now that it wasn't just her life that was at stake, but the lives of many others. They had to fight for justice, even if the cost was high. "I'm ready," she said, her voice stronger than ever. "Let's get this over with once and for all." John, standing next to them, knew this was only the beginning. They were entering a dangerous game, where not only their fates were at stake, but the fates of everyone who had ever suffered injustice. But they were ready. Marissa lay in the hospital room, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. She knew this was her chance and opportunity not only to recover, but to begin the fight for the justice she had always strived to defend. Her thoughts swirled around those who had suffered at the hands of the Sons of Liberty, and those who still remained silent out of fear. Chief Inspector Brown, sitting at the desk in her room, soon began asking questions. "We've received information about your situation," he said, his voice stern and businesslike. "Your case has attracted the attention of local and federal authorities. We're going to join forces to stop this group." Marissa felt her heart beat faster. This was the moment she could do something meaningful. "I'm ready to help," she said, and her voice was confident. "I know what they're planning, and I have information about who they're working with." Brown leaned closer, his eyes full of interest. "Good. We need to document everything you know. Every little fact could be key to our investigation." "They threaten me," Marissa continued, trying to remember every detail. "I know who's funding them, and maybe we can find out who's behind our actions. They have connections with the local police and high-ranking officials." Brown wrote down everything she said. "These are serious allegations," he said, his voice determined. "If we can prove this, it could lead to the arrests of not only the group's members, but also corrupt police officers." Marissa felt hope ignite inside her. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was willing to risk it for the truth. The day after he was released from the hospital, John and Marissa met in his office. They looked at a map of the city that had sites associated with the Sons of Liberty marked on it. "We have addresses to check," John said, pointing to one of the markers. "That's their headquarters, but it's best not to go there without backup. We need to figure out what's going on inside," Marissa countered. "If we can gather enough evidence, it'll give us an advantage." At that moment the office door opened and Laura walked into the room. She looked worried. "I heard that you were going to check their headquarters," she said. "It is very dangerous. You need help, and it is best not to act alone." Marissa looked at John and they both knew she was right. "We can attract a group of activists," John suggested. "Many of them are willing to fight and help. We can do this together." They started calling local activists, and soon a small team of 5 people had formed. They were determined people, willing to take risks to fight injustice. The next day, having assembled on site, the team stood in front of the abandoned building that served as the headquarters of the Sons of Liberty. It was an old 2-story structure, full of cracks and dark windows from which ghosts seemed to peer out. "How do we proceed?" asked one of the activists. Kim, she was energetic, with bright hair and a fiery spirit. "We'll split into groups," John suggested. "Me and Marissa will be in one group, and you'll be in another. If anyone sees us, we're to act quickly and leave. Our goal is to gather information and, if possible, record their conversations." Marissa felt the adrenaline rushing through her veins. This was real surgery, and she was ready. They made their way inside the building, past old doors and moldy hallways. It was dark and cold inside, and every rustle seemed too loud. Marissa walked next to John, her heart pounding with excitement. "We have to find the room where the meeting is taking place," she whispered, her voice determined. Suddenly they heard voices coming from one of the rooms. Marissa and John stopped, listening. Inside, someone was talking about upcoming plans and how they could act against the people who were against them. "We can't let them continue their fight," said one of the voices, and Marissa recognized it. It was the leader of the Sons of Liberty. "We need to show that we are stronger. If any of them try to oppose us, we will do to them what we did to the others." She felt her blood boil with rage. She knew this might be her only chance to stop them. "We need to write this down," she whispered to John. "It could be important evidence." They began to creep quietly towards the door when suddenly there was a crash behind them. One of the activists, Kim, accidentally hit something and the sound was like a gunshot. "Damn," John cursed, and they both went back to hide. Screams were heard inside the room. "Who's there?" one of the group members shouted. "Run!" Kim screamed, realizing they had been spotted. The situation was getting out of hand. The group of Sons of Liberty started to leave the room, and Marissa knew they had to go. They rushed towards the exit, but suddenly one of the doors swung open and a large man with an aggressive expression walked out. "You won't get away," he shouted, approaching them. Marissa, without thinking, grabbed John's hand and they ran into the nearest door, which turned out to be a storage room. "Close it," she shouted, trying to hold the door. They heard men pounding on the door, trying to break in. Inside the storage room were old boxes and tools. Marissa and John tried to breathe evenly, knowing they had no choice but to wait. "We need to come up with a plan," she said as John stared tensely at the door. "If they get through, we need to be ready." They started searching around, and soon John found an old cane. "Maybe this will help if we need to fight," he said, taking it in his hands. Suddenly the door swung open and a bright light came down on them. A group of men started laughing as they entered the storeroom. "Well, have you caught the mice?" one of them said mockingly, approaching. Marissa felt her heart skip a beat. "We will not give up," she said, gathering all her strength. "Oh, yeah," the group leader said, pointing at them. "You think you can make a difference? Your days are numbered." Marissa and John took advantage of the moment and darted in the other direction, running past the men who were too busy looking for a way out. "Faster!" John shouted as they ran out of the pantry. Outside, they saw the police starting to enter the building. This was their opportunity. "We need to report what happened here," Marissa shouted as they ran for the exit. But at that moment she saw Raymond standing at the edge of the street, his face full of worry. "Marissa," he shouted, running up to her, "I came as soon as I heard you were here." "Ray, we have to leave," she said, realizing that the situation was dangerous. At that moment, a group of men came out into the street, and one of them shouted, "Don't let them get away." The police were in action and panic was setting in. The situation was escalating and Marissa knew things might not end the way they had hoped. "We must fight," she said, determination igniting in her heart. "We must stop them once and for all." And at that moment she realized that this was not just her personal fight, but a fight for all those who suffered from racism and injustice. The strength she felt inside was powerful, and she was ready to fight until the end. As chaos erupted around them, Marissa, John and Raymond felt like every moment could be crucial as they made their way through the crowd. They headed toward a police car parked nearby. "We need to get the word out about what's going on," Marissa said, her voice full of determination. "This isn't just a fight for us. This is a fight for everyone who suffers from this hate." Raymond nodded, but his face looked worried. "I heard there were policemen among them," he said, his voice shaking. "Maybe even some who work with the Sons of Liberty." Marissa knew it might be true. She had long suspected that racism permeated every level of government, but now she was on the verge of uncovering it. They opened the door of the police car when a scream caught their attention. "You there!" one of the Sons of Liberty men shouted from the steps of the building they had just been in. "Stop! You can't escape!" At that moment, as they were trying to reach the car, a light flashed. Police cars surrounded the building, and in their shadows a figure appeared, Captain Lara, a tall, stern officer with an icy gaze. "Get your hands off your car," she shouted, her voice threatening. Marissa felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Lara was one of those cops who didn't mind turning a blind eye to racism. She'd heard about her connection to the Sons of Liberty many times. "It's a trap," John shouted, realizing that they could be in even greater danger. The situation was getting tense, the police were closing in, and Marissa knew they didn't have time to think. "Run!" she screamed, and they ran in different directions to distract attention. But the moment they separated, Marissa heard a loud shot. Her heart froze. "John!" she screamed, but he was nowhere to be seen. Panic gripped her. She stopped and looked back. John, falling to the ground, covered his face with his hand, and at that moment she saw Laura approaching him. "You won't escape responsibility," she said with cold confidence. Marissa clenched her fists, her inner anger flaring to its limit. She knew this situation wasn't just an accident, it was a manifestation of how the system could protect hatred and oppression. "Leave him alone," she screamed, running towards them. Laura turned to face her, a sneer appearing on her face. "You think you can change anything?" she said. "You're just a black judge, and I'm a police captain. The system is on my side." Marissa felt her anger rise. In that moment, she realized that there was more at stake than just her own life or John's. This was a fight for a voice for everyone who suffered from racism. "If I'm just a judge, then why am I here, standing before you?" she said, her voice ringing with force. "I won't let you silence people the way you silence your hatred." Laura smiled and nodded to her subordinates. "Take her away," she said, and immediately several police officers rushed towards her. Marissa felt everything around her begin to quiet down. She knew that if she didn't fight, all their efforts would be in vain. In that moment, she remembered her mission, that she was not only a judge, but also a voice for those who could not speak. She turned and ran back to the building, her mind racing between plan and action. "Stay together," she shouted to her activists as they gathered at the entrance. Inside the building, an unexpected turn awaited them. When they entered, they saw that there were several more people inside, who, as it turned out, were also victims of the Sons of Liberty group. People who had been lost before, now gathered their forces together. "We can't leave it like this," said one of them, a middle-aged man with a wounded face. "They did this to us, and we want revenge." Marissa felt a new hope ignite within her. Together, they could do more than just resist. This could be a revolution. "We can organize a meeting," she suggested. "If we gather everyone who suffered at the hands of these people, it will make a big statement." As sure as she was that they could do it, thoughts of John still troubled her. He was out there somewhere, and she had to find him. Meanwhile, John, trying to pull himself out from under the pressure, noticed that the police were regrouping, and he could use this moment to get out. He gritted his teeth and, using all his strength, abruptly broke free from the grip. "Marissa!" he screamed, breaking free from Captain Lara's grasp. But he didn't know that the next minute he found himself face to face with several police officers. They surrounded him and he felt hopelessness washing over him. "We have to get out of here," he shouted toward the building where he hoped the others were. Marissa and her team had already started making plans, but she couldn't get what had happened to John out of her head. Suddenly, someone walked into the room. It was Laura with several officers, and her face was glowing with hatred. "Everyone is here to help, but you can't escape," she said, raising her hand to stop the noise. "We know what you're doing," Marissa said, her voice strong. "We won't let you continue." Laura chuckled. "You can't stop me. You have no evidence. You have no power. I am the law." Marissa felt her rage wash over her again. She couldn't let Laura talk like that, and her resolve grew even stronger. "You have the power," she said, and there was passion in her voice. "But we have the truth. The truth is what will lead to justice." Laura leaned towards her, and contempt was visible in her eyes. "Your words are worthless," she said. "You'll just be another victim." But at that moment John came around the corner. He was making his way with difficulty, but there was determination in his eyes. "I won't let this happen," he said, turning to Laura. "We are not just victims. We are people who are ready to fight." And at that moment, there was a loud explosion that shook the building. Everyone turned around, and in the chaos, they saw a crowd of people gathered outside break into the building. They were activists who had come to support their comrades. "We are for justice," they shouted, and this became a signal for everyone. Marissa felt a light go on inside her. In that moment, as their united efforts began to fall apart, she realized that this was no longer just their fight. It was the fight of everyone who had suffered from racism, oppression, and injustice. Together, they could change the course of events, and though the situation looked grim, they knew that there was a fire burning in their hearts, a fire that neither lies nor hatred could extinguish. "We will fight," Marissa said, her voice like thunder, bouncing off the walls, "and we will not stop until justice is served." The crowd began to move forward, and this was only the beginning of a new struggle that was to change everything. The force of popular anger erupted in the building that had once been silent and fearful. The crowd of activists who had gathered outside rushed in, and despite the panic, everyone sensed that this was a turning point. They were no longer just victims, they were the driving force. Marissa, John, and other activists quickly organized themselves. They realized that they now needed not only to survive, but also to create a platform to fight the racism that permeated their entire society. "We have to get this on camera," Kim said, grabbing her phone. "We have to go live." "Yes," Marissa agreed. "Let everyone see what's going on. We need to get attention to attract support." They quickly set up the equipment and began broadcasting. On the other side of the screen, people began to gather, commenting, supporting, and some even calling local news channels to report what was happening. The camera captured everything from the frightened faces of the Sons of Liberty members who began to retreat toward the exit, to the furious faces of the activists who, despite their fear, were full of determination. "This isn't just a fight for us," Marissa said into the camera, her voice filled with powerful energy. "This is a fight for the rights of all people who suffer from racism and oppression." There were shouts in the background. The police who had surrounded the building began to advance, but this time the activists had support. They began to shout slogans, loud and determined. "Justice for all," the crowd shouted, their voices merging into one. In the midst of all this confusion, Raymond appeared, making his way through the crowd. He quickly approached Marissa and John. "I heard that we are being followed. We need to be more careful. Laura has her own people who can interfere at any moment," he said with alarm. "We can't stop," Marissa replied, looking him in the eye with confidence. "We're on the right path. If we back out now, we'll never change this system." Suddenly, a loud sound was heard as the group of Sons of Liberty began to retreat, and their leader, Chris, appeared among them. He was a large, menacing-looking man with black skin, his face full of hatred. Chris screamed, turning to his subordinates. "Get rid of these impudent people. We can't let them destroy our business." The words, full of malice, froze in the air for a moment. "You can't stop us," Marissa said, stepping forward, and there was something in her voice that shocked Chris. "Your hatred will no longer oppress the people. We are a force to be reckoned with." Chris chuckled, but there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. He hadn't expected such resistance. This wasn't just a group of activists. This was a real community united against racism. "You're all just puppets," Chris shouted, but his words were lost among the shouts of the crowd. Marissa felt a strength building inside her. Her spirit grew stronger as she realized that she had gathered around her not just like-minded people, but her real family, ready to fight for their rights. "We all have a right to equality and fairness," she said, "and we're not going to let you take that away." Chris tried to grab his gun, but at that moment the sound of sirens was heard. The police officers who had previously tried to detain the activists began to open fire in the air. Their actions were harsh and brutal. "Stay together," John shouted, raising his hands to call for order. But panic gripped the crowd and they began to scatter in different directions. Marissa felt her heart sink. No, we can't just give up," she screamed, but the sound of her voice was lost in the chaos. Raymond grabbed her hand and he and John began to move toward the exit. They made their way through the anxious crowd and soon found themselves outside, where a crowd of protesters had gathered outside the building. "We need to gather people," Marissa said, her voice full of determination. "We can't retreat." "I'm going to the buses," John said. "I'll be back with reinforcements." "I'm with you," Raymond said, and they both ran to the buses. Meanwhile, chaos erupted in the building. The police began to pull people out, arresting those who resisted. Chris and his group began to take action, and soon screams could be heard in the street. "Run!" one of the activists shouted, but there were too many of them. Marissa knew they had to find a way to stop this before it was too late. She quickly glanced at her allies and shouted, "Let's unite! If we are together, we can do it!" The crowd of people standing nearby suddenly felt a fire ignite within them. They began to raise their hands and shout, "For justice, for equality, we will not give up." Every word, every cry felt like a powerful blow to the walls of hatred that had encircled their hearts for centuries. And at that moment, a new unexpected twist appeared. One of the policemen, who was having trouble breathing from anger and shame, stepped out of the line and raised his hands. "I can't stand this any longer," he shouted, his voice loud and confident. "I'm against this. I don't want to take part in this chaos." The crowd froze, and many eyes were fixed on him. "This is wrong. We all deserve equality," he continued, his voice growing stronger. Marissa felt tears welling up in her eyes. She knew this was what they were all waiting for, support from those who served the system. "You are not alone," she screamed, and the crowd echoed her cry. The policeman, it turned out, was not the only one who felt that something needed to change. Soon, other officers joined him in speaking out against their service, protesting hatred and oppression. "We are together," they shouted, their loud voices merging with the cries of the crowd. It was incredible. The system they were trying to break began to crack at the seams. Soon the hostility on the streets began to change to a united call for justice. "We have the power," Marissa said, her words like a light in the darkness. "We will fight for equality, and no one can stop us." At that moment the sky turned gray, but it wasn't just rain. It was a sign that change was coming. It was a sign of a new beginning. They knew that the fight was just beginning, but a fire had lit up in their hearts, a fire of justice that no one could now extinguish. Amidst the chaos around them, the crowd's energy grew. Activists, police officers, bystanders, everyone was part of this heated moment. Marissa, determined, felt a fire burning in her heart. She knew they weren't just fighting for their rights, but for the rights of everyone who had suffered from oppression and prejudice. Meanwhile, John and Raymond returned with the buses, bringing a group of activists who joined their fight. People began to unite, and each of them realized that now, more than ever, they had to act together. "We must form a defensive line," John shouted, raising his hands. "Let's build a barricade." The crowd, united, began to collect everything that could be used as a means of protection: garbage containers, trees, even old cars. Chris and his group watched this with displeasure. They had not expected the protesters to organize so quickly. Chris knew he could not let them get the upper hand and shouted vehemently to his subordinates, "Let's set it all on fire. We can't give them power." The crowd held its breath as Chris threw the Molotov cocktail onto the collected items. At that moment, Marissa, as if sensing what was about to happen, shouted, "Stop!" She rushed towards the barricade, her voice full of confidence. "We will not hate like you. We will show that we can fight peacefully. If you set this on fire, you will only strengthen our resolve." The crowd stood still, listening to her words. Marissa turned to Chris, her eyes full of courage. "You don't understand what you're doing," she continued. "Every time you raise your hand against us, you raise it against yourself. We're here to change the world, not destroy it." Inside, Chris felt the pressure from his subordinates and hesitated. He never thought that his actions could cause such a strong reaction. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice tense. "We can start a dialogue," Marissa replied, her eyes shining with hope. "We can talk about how we can live together, regardless of skin color." At that moment, Raymond stood next to her, supporting her. "We are not your enemies," he said. "We just want to be heard and respected. Hate breeds hate. If we don't stop this, we will never see peace." The crowd of activists began to roar in approval of their words. The energy permeated the air, creating a sense of unity. Chris felt his subordinates looking at him, waiting for a decision. He saw some of them begin to doubt, and it shattered his confidence. "That won't solve the problem," someone on his team shouted. They're just using it to manipulate us." But others who heard Marissa and Raymond speak began to shake their heads. "We have to try," said one of the policemen, who had previously spoken out against his superior's actions. "Maybe they are right. If we don't try to understand each other, we will never find a solution." The situation escalated. Soon Chris, realizing that control was slipping out of his hands, noticed how the situation was getting out of control. "If you don't want to listen to me," he said, his voice like the rumble of a thunderstorm, "I'll show you what real strength means." At this point, the real conflict began. The police, dedicated to their cause, began to rise up against their own, while the activists became more and more determined in their fight. "We're not against you," Marissa shouted again, but her voice was lost in the general noise. Suddenly, shots rang out, the police opened fire, and the crowd of activists screamed and ran in different directions. Fear and panic gripped everyone. Marissa screamed, but her voice was lost in the thunder. She felt that this moment was decisive in their fight. Chris, under pressure, began to act. His fear turned to anger. He saw his team begin to fall apart, and it finally broke him. "Don't let them escape," he shouted, and his subordinates began to follow him. But now there was fear in their eyes, not hatred. Someone from the crowd of activists, seeing what was happening, began to film it. People appeared who began to shout slogans. The participants in the struggle united again, realizing that this night would be historic. "We will stand to the end," shouted one of the activists, and his words conveyed everyone's feelings. Marissa, John and Raymond, having gathered together, saw that the situation could become critical. "We need to create a safe place," Marissa said, her voice confident. "We can't let them tear us apart." They began to organize a group to unite and create a defensive line. "Wherever we go together," John shouted, his words filled with determination. "We can't let hatred divide us." Meanwhile, journalists appeared in the crowd and began covering the event. They realized that this event had attracted the attention of the entire country. Soon, news reports began to appear showing the conflict between police and activists escalating into chaos. Images of a nation being torn apart began to spread across the screen, and more people supported the activists. "You are not alone," shouted one of the policemen, who had previously remained in the shadows. "We are with you." These words became a signal for the others. The police began to gather around the activists, creating a new front. Chris looked at his subordinates with bewilderment. He did not expect such a turn of events. "What's wrong with you?" he shouted, his voice sounding angry. But his words no longer found a response. People no longer wanted to be part of a system that led them to hate. Soon a new group formed, consisting of police officers and activists. They began to protect each other from the rioters. "We have to show that we are united," Marissa said, her voice a call to action. "If we act together, we can make a difference." And then something amazing happened. The police, who had previously ruthlessly suppressed protests, began to approach the activists, explaining their fears and doubts. "We ourselves suffer," said one of the officers, his voice quiet. "Our work is dangerous too, but we don't want it." Marissa felt that the situation was changing. This was not just a fight between the two groups. It was an opportunity for them to learn from each other. "Let's discuss what we can do together," she said, her eyes shining with hope. The crowd froze and a sense of unity filled the air. The idea of dialogue began to grow. People who had previously been adversaries now began to realize that they could unite for the common good. Chris, realizing that his old methods weren't working, knew he had to take a step back. "Let's talk," he said, his voice calmer. "I was wrong to lead you to hatred." The crowd froze in anticipation. Everyone knew that this moment could be a turning point. "We are all human," Raymond said, raising his hands. "Let's find a way to live together instead of against each other." At that moment, there was a sense that hatred and prejudice were beginning to recede. Everyone began to realize that they could create a new society free of hatred and racism. And this was only the first step. Their journey to understanding and unity was just beginning, but they were ready to accept the challenge and move forward. The discussion that began on the heated streets suddenly became an important moment for everyone. Every voice, every opinion, every word resounded in the air. as if an old, dusty mechanism had started working again. Marissa, standing in the center, noticed how the people around her were beginning to gather together. Police officers and activists, whose gazes had been full of hatred just minutes before, now met with eyes full of hope and curiosity. "We're all here because we care about our communities," she said, her voice confident. "No one wants to see destruction. We want a better future." Chris, still consumed by anger but influenced by his subordinates, slowly began to realize that the fight he was waging was not just against the activists, it was against himself. He saw several police officers begin to put away their shields and weapons, renounce violence. "If we can't talk, if we can't understand each other," he said, his voice growing quieter, "then who are we really?" Chris's words had an effect. People froze, looking at him with interest and caution. "I have never seen any of you suffer," he continued, addressing the activists. "We have only heard about your protests, but we have never thought about what lies behind them." There were cheers from the crowd. People began to share their personal stories of how racism had affected their lives. One of the activists, an older man named James, stepped forward. "I lost my grandson to bias," he said, his voice shaking. "He just walked out on the street and got pulled over because of the color of his skin. I always thought of police officers as protectors." Chris listened, his eyes filling with tears. He knew that his own actions could once have been the cause of fear for people like James. "We all want fear to define our lives," James continued. "We want our families to be safe." The crowd began to respond, and the tension gradually died down. Others began to share their stories. A young woman named Lauren told how her brother had been wrongfully arrested for a crime he did not commit. "Every time I see the police," she said, "I fear for my family. I don't want to live in fear." Chris, realizing that these people were not enemies, but the same victims of the system, could not restrain himself. "I'm sorry for everything I've done," he said to the crowd, "for all the disappointments, for the fear, for the hatred." The crowd froze and silence hung in the air. It was an unexpected confession. Chris's words were sincere, and people felt it. "We can make a difference if we work together," Marissa said, her words resonating with everyone around her. Those gathered began to exchange ideas about how the situation could be changed. The discussion became increasingly constructive. They talked about the need for reform, about how the police could work together with the community to create a safe environment. Someone in the crowd suggested the idea of creating a committee, which would include both activists and police representatives, to discuss problems and find solutions. "This will be our bridge," said one of the young men standing nearby. "We can create a space where everyone can voice their concerns and ideas." The discussion continued and gradually became more and more inspiring. People began to remember their dreams, how they see a world without racism. "We all want our children to be able to play outside without fear," Lauren said. "We want them to grow up in a world where they are valued for their actions, not the color of their skin." Marissa noticed how some of the police officers began to join the conversation, offering their ideas on how they could better engage with local communities. "We can organize open meetings with the population," one of the officers suggested. "This will help us understand what you want and eliminate prejudices." "Yes," another policewoman agreed. "This will allow us to build trust and openness." Marissa felt her heart fill with hope. "This is exactly what we need," she said, her voice full of confidence. "Let's start this journey together." At that moment, despite the chaos that had preceded it, everyone began to realize that this day was the beginning of something new. This was not just a meeting, it was a promise of change. The crowd started clapping and it was like music filling the air. People hugged each other and smiles appeared on their faces. It was the moment of unity they had all been waiting for. But as often happens when change begins, there were still those who disagreed. Opponents began to appear in the crowd who could not accept what was happening. "It's just a masquerade," one of them shouted, his voice full of hatred. "They will never change." A few people, swayed by his words, began to shout, provoking the crowd. Suddenly, all this threatened the atmosphere of unity that had just been achieved. "Stop!" Marissa shouted, her voice sounding like an alarm bell. "Don't let hate divide us again." But the outrage continued to grow. and Chris felt that it was now necessary to take the initiative. "We can't let this fuel hatred," he said, addressing those shouting provocations. "We are all here to create a better future, and if you want to be part of that, you need to understand that we are all human beings." Chris's words, although not immediately, began to have an effect. Some of the opponents began to think, and this gave a chance for dialogue. "Let's talk," he said. "Express your fears and grievances, but let's do it peacefully." Marissa, seeing that Chris had taken the initiative, walked up to him and supported him. "We all want to be heard," she said. "This is our common cause, and it must be based on understanding, not hatred." Gradually, the dialogue began to develop and the tension in the air began to subside. People began to share their fears, and this became a key moment in their interaction. "We don't want wars," one of the men said. "We just want to be understood." The discussion continued and soon they began to look for ways to collaborate. Each of them began to see that the only thing that separated them was the fear and prejudice that was being imposed on them. Gradually the atmosphere in the square began to change, and instead of conflicts and hatred, respect and a desire to work together began to appear. "This day can be the start of something great," Lauren said, and her words resonated with many. "If we work together, we can create a world we can be proud of." And despite all the challenges, Marissa, Chris, and John stood together and felt that their voices could create change. This was the beginning of a new era, and they were ready for this journey. As Marissa watched people come together, she felt that there was more going on than just a conversation. She saw how fear and hatred gradually gave way to understanding and unity. This was the beginning of a new era, and she knew that each of them was a part of something important. Several weeks had passed since the conflict in the square. A group of activists and police officers had gathered to discuss how their city could be changed for the better. The understanding that emerged that evening became the basis for the creation of a new security committee, which included representatives from both law enforcement and local communities. At the first meeting of the committee, everyone was hopeful. They discussed how to make everyone feel safe and heard. The police began holding open meetings with residents to discuss issues that were of concern to the local population. "We don't want fear to define our lives," Lauren said at one meeting. "We want our kids to play outside and not be afraid of the police." These words resonated with many. Gradually, stereotypes began to crumble, and trust emerged between the police and activists. People who had previously considered each other enemies now became allies in the fight for a better future. Chris, who became a leading voice on the committee, was a vocal advocate for reform. He understood that change required more than just words. He personally initiated training for police officers on racial bias and community engagement. Marissa, still full of energy, continued to speak at rallies. She spoke about the importance of unity, respect, and dialogue. She saw how her words inspired people and how they began to act. "We are all part of this society," she said at one of the meetings. "Together, we can create a world in which everyone feels safe and respected." Meanwhile, positive reports about the city's transformation began to appear in the media. Finally, they were seen not as a source of problems, but as an example to follow. Other cities began to show interest in how they had managed to achieve such changes. But one day, an unexpected guest showed up at the meeting. It was James, the same old man who had first shared his story of losing his grandson. He came up on stage and said, "I never thought I'd see a moment like this. When I lost my grandson, I felt like the world had collapsed. But now, looking at you all, I see hope." James turned to Chrissy and added, "I forgive you. We all need forgiveness to move forward." The tears in the eyes of many in the room were a sign that they were on the right path. Everyone understood that change does not happen overnight, but they were all moving towards this goal together. Marissa and Chris stood on stage and hugged. It was a symbol of the unity they had all been searching for. They understood that the fight for equality and justice was not just their personal stories, but the stories of everyone who had suffered from bias. "We're not alone," Chris said, his voice shaking with emotion. "Together, we can change the world." The room erupted in applause and the atmosphere was filled with optimism. Everyone knew they had a lot of work ahead of them, but they were ready to take on the challenge. A city once divided by hatred and prejudice was now a symbol of hope and change. People began to work on their stereotypes, and a community that was once divided was now becoming united. And while the road to justice was long, they knew that together they could overcome any obstacle. This was the beginning of a new chapter where every voice mattered and where everyone, no matter the color of their skin, could be proud to be a part of this community. At that moment, they became not just witnesses of change, but active participants in its creation. This experience became not only a lesson for them, but also an inspiration, and ahead of them, a bright, promising path awaited them, full of hope and unity. Dear viewers, we really want to know your opinion about our story. Do you think the characters were able to overcome prejudice and hatred? Have you ever experienced racism in your life? And how did you deal with it? Your stories are very, very important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it if you enjoyed it. Have a wonderful day.